AI Expo for National Competitiveness 2024 welcomes you to the center stage for a fascinating conversation on where we are now with AI and what the future will bring. Please welcome to the stage the chair of the Special Competitive Studies, Eric Schmidt, and he is welcomed by editor of Foreign Affairs, Daniel Kurtz-Phelan.
I think that's the most rousing introduction I've ever gotten, so thank you.
I love the rock star part of
Exactly. I don't normally get that in wonky foreign policy discussions, but good afternoon, welcome all. I'm Dan Kurtz-Phelan, the editor of Foreign Affairs magazine. I'm very honored to be up here for a conversation with one of our hosts, Eric Schmidt. He is someone who needs an introduction in very few rooms, but certainly not in this one, so I will not waste any time on that. Eric, thanks for putting this together. Thanks for all the thinking you've been doing on this, including in foreign affairs. And thanks for doing this conversation. I should say we will have audience Q&A partway through. I will resist the temptation to hog all this time. So please save your questions, and we'll get to those in the last portion of this conversation.
Okay, can I do one thing?
Absolutely.
First, I wanted to say thanks to everybody for coming. I hope this has been worth your time. It's certainly been worth mine. I don't think I've ever seen this kind of excitement around national security and competitiveness in America, and certainly not in DC. So our goal was to actually have an impact, and the only way to do that is to do it with you as our partners. I also wanted to say that we're going to be releasing a vision for competitiveness in the next few weeks, which is now in draft form, is being revised based on the things we've heard from you. And another thing I wanted to say is that we're going to do this again. This has been so successful that we're very much committed to this and committed to making sure America stays the truly competitive place that it can be in the world. I think everybody here is in one form or another a great patriot, and I want us all to work together to make America what it needs to be. So thank you all for being here. Dan?
Thank you, Eric, for that starting note. And with apologies for kicking off on a somewhat self-referential note, I want to go to the essay you wrote a little over a year ago in Foreign Affairs called Innovation Power.
By the way, this was your idea, so we can do it together.
Fair enough, but it grew out of conversations with you. And I want to take what I think is really the central point in that piece, central argument in a very rich and in many ways far-seeing piece. You note that the capacity for innovation, the speed of innovation, has long been central to national power, to geopolitical competition, but you argue that this time is different. It's not just an ingredient of our economic or military or cultural power, that there's something distinctly new happening. What is that, and why in fact is this time different?
I think you see this point in non-military, non-national security areas also. The most valuable companies in the world are all now tech companies. That should be an indication to you that what is happening is much bigger than a single company or your project or your whatever you're doing. And so my argument, which came out of our conversations, was that the traditional framing in foreign policy and political science is hard power, which is essentially weapons, and soft power, which is essentially culture and influence. And I don't think that's quite right. I think the way you're going to win is by the speed with which you can innovate. And whether it's in the hard power regime or the soft power regime. And the reason it's happening is because technology is building platforms that are very different and global in nature. So let's think about Hollywood as an example. That's soft power. Well, now you have, I'll give you a specific example. The number one app in America is TikTok, which can be understood as television, which is an app whose source code is controlled by China, right? That's a very different example of soft power, and not one that most people want to acknowledge. But there's no question that it's having an impact. We can debate good or bad. That's an example of innovation power. Another example of innovation power has been the courage and resistance in Ukraine against a much larger adversary, where they used the innovation to hold on and for a while to buy time. Now you're seeing their innovation power against the Russian hard power. So we're going to see whether the argument that we make in that piece can really hold at scale. There are people who are our critics who say innovation is great, but eventually the gentleman with the biggest hammer wins. I'm not sure that's true. In fact, we argue that it isn't true. We argue that over a long term, competitiveness, which is an American concept here, is around innovation at scale. And innovation at scale doesn't mean 3 people, it means 1,000 people working to build complicated and powerful systems that work together.
So there's a lot I want to pick up on there, but let me start with the China piece, which is, of course, central to this conversation. You write in the essay, I'm quoting you here, the ability to innovate faster and better will determine the outcome of the great power competition between the United States and China. How do you assess the state of AI development in China today, and where do you think the US may be losing its edge?
So for the rest of our lives, the strategic fight, which is a competitive fight, not an enemy fight at the moment, will define what we do. China is smart, well-managed, managed in a very different way than I would ever want to work in a country, of course, but they're good at what they do. Don't underestimate them. They have all sorts of problems, but even in that area, they're doing things like becoming the dominant player in electric vehicles. Not something I would have predicted, but it's obviously a part of their industrial policy, which is different from ours. The good news is that they're well behind now in the AI front, and AI is the platform for everything. And they're well behind for a number of reasons. One is the current generation of tools are trained using language. There's a lot more English language than there is Chinese language on the web. They're working on that, but that's an example of a difference. Another is that the Trump and Biden administrations limited access to chips essentially above what are called A100s. So the current and next generation of chips are not available to China, and that makes it much harder for them to leapfrog and stay competitive. And the third is that their industrial model is a little different. They're trying to make money with AI apps, which is a good thing to do, and they'll probably succeed given the success of other apps globally. But the core platform stuff that is being done in America is being done with huge venture risk pools, billions of dollars. That amount of money is not available in the Chinese system. So the Chinese technical people feel hamstrung by all of this, and the government is trying to figure out how to fix that.
When you look at the state of innovation in the United States and compare it to what's happening in China, are there areas where you worry that we may not be maintaining our lead in the way we should?
In general or in
AI specifically?
So far, it looks like China will lead in surveillance, and they're going to be very good at that. It also looks like they're going to ultimately have to regulate their AI systems pretty heavily to keep to their rules about speech and freedom. And so it's probably the case that and I'm guessing here, that as the Chinese government has to shut down some of the speech, some of the activities and so forth, it will constrain their innovation. This is an advantage, we'll see, this is an advantage that democracies have, that the rule of freedom and free speech allows for this kind of crazy innovation, harder in China.
So the other dimension of the US-China dynamic here has to do with risks and arms races and all the dangers that flow from that. You wrote a book about AI with Henry Kissinger. I would note that the last article that he ever published was something he wrote in Foreign Affairs in October, shortly before his death, making the case for AI talks between the US and China. What do you think those talks could achieve, and what in that US-China dynamic do you think they should really be focused on?
So Henry and I were very, very close, and I miss him every day. And as he was literally getting more ill at the age of 100.5, which is remarkable, he did the work that you described, which is magical. He also finished his last book with Craig Mundy and myself as co-authors, which will be published later this year, roughly on the anniversary of his death is our current plan. And it's about the societal and cultural implications of AI, especially as we saw it as he was dying. So I hope that you all get a chance to read it. Henry was a strong proponent of starting the conversations with China now. Not because we want to educate them or vice versa, but that if you believe that the strategic competition, great power competition between China and the US is defining, you know this is going to become a problem. So what he proposed, and we have begun after his death, is a series of what are called Track 2 dialogues. And the government is starting a series of Track 1 dialogues. So I went to one, so the first one. So the Americans are all dressed casually, and we're all on Zoom, we're all having a nice conversation. And the Chinese are all organized, they're very serious, they have all their talking points. So now I understand what real diplomacy is like. So we've agreed to keep these meetings. There is general agreement that we should, and this, when I say agreement, I mean in theory, not in any specific way, that we need to take advantage of the strengths of AI, and we need to make sure that some of the calamitous things that could occur don't occur. And I've been pushing for a no surprises rule. So in other words, if China does something that might surprise us, they should tell us ahead of time, and vice versa, which I think keeps everything calmer. We will see. It has begun. But it will. What I now believe is this will take a long time.
I thought you might say that real diplomacy, and I say this as a former State Department official, is also very boring sometimes, but we will leave that aside.
I may come to that conclusion if everybody starts repeating their position. I mean, the key questions have to do with societal risk. So we have shared risk. A nuclear war is obviously a shared risk. There are things that an AI system that could do that would be a shared risk. One of the ones that's been an issue in the US, and we spoke about this when I was doing the AI Commission, is that in America, there is a guarantee that a human, in this case, the president, makes a decision around nuclear. That's a good rule. The same doctrine and rule does not exist in a number of other nuclear countries, right? So in theory, you could end up with a situation in this very bad situation where an automated decision was made that would lead to huge consequences. So that's an example.
Turning the focus towards our own side a bit, you've, after a long and very distinguished career in the private sector, a decade or so ago, turned your attention and energies to the U.S. government. You've held a slew of positions on the Defense Innovation Board, of course, the Special Competitive Studies Project, the National AI Commission. Just to start on a somewhat conceptual level, when you first started entering into conversations on policy with people in the public sector, what struck you as the kind of difference between the way those in government and those in the private sector think about these issues and talk about them? Where was the conceptual disconnect?
So I got interested in this because there's a long tradition of scientists who are no longer as current as they are helping the nation. And I thought that would be a good role for me because I wasn't useful as a scientist anymore. That was my self-view. And the one way to understand the government is it's a relatively low-trust environment and power is diffused. And here's the way it plays out. If you go back to the Skunk Works model of the 60s in Lockheed, which was super successful, you would have a colonel who had enough budgetary authority that they would experiment with a new airplane design, and they would fly it and it wouldn't work, it would crash, and then they would iterate. Everything I just told you is illegal today, right? So the way the procurement in the government has ended up, because it's a low trust environment, is that you have to write a specification, then you have to, and you're not allowed to talk to the vendors, then you down select to a vendor, then you choose a vendor. The vendor takes years to build the product, and part of that is stopped because when the award is made, it's contested for a couple of years in court, and everyone basically competes, collaborates, and sues at the same time. This is a highly inefficient system, which is fine if you want to spend a lot of money of the country and you're at peacetime. So in other words, I have no objection to the government funding large groups to do things which are very slow as long as we don't need them to work, right? And I'm being serious because what happens is a requirements specification means that you're setting a specification for something that will occur years from now in an innovation model you just don't know. Another example is the government is horrific in buying and using software. This is true on the commercial side. A good example is that they were having, I visited, in my military work, I visited a group called Transcom, which is the group that manages all the logistics. And you can imagine this is very important for the military. So they had a room full of soldiers in uniform, right, who are copying the ICN codes, whatever they're called, from the different shippers manually from screen to screen, often by memory. And these are excellently trained in uniform soldiers. It's just insane. So I asked them how they were going to fix this, and they said, oh, we're doing a procurement. And the procurement, of course, will take 5 years. So these poor engineers are going to continue doing this. I can give you example after example. The soldiers are going to do this. So this is the simplest kind of efficiency improvements, and yet the system does not. We're not even talking about weapons and innovation. We're just talking about copying from one screen to the other, right? I know how to solve that problem, and even at my rusty programming skills, I can write the code. So you see my point. So it's a misallocation of resources, and because the government doesn't understand how software works. I'll give you another example. I was with a very senior general, and I said, I made this complaint, and this very senior general goes, I tried it. I said, oh my God, what happened? And he said, I hired the software people, and then they were collected. And I said, what does that mean? That means they were taken away from me. And I said, you are like a 7-star general. And he goes, yes. And I said, and you can't even get, I mean, I don't know how many people, he came out of 100,000 people or something like this. You can't get 50 programmers? And he said, absolutely not. Now that's insane. It's just insane. It's a misallocation of resources. Give the guy the 50 programmers so that he can make whatever weapons or systems or move people around or whatever. And the story that I give you is replicated over and over again. And it's not just in the military. We're obviously very focused on our national security here. It's also true in the commercial sector. And that's why you continue to see these problems. In the Obama administration, a group was set up, both in the White House and also in the Defense Department, which were basically digital volunteers that you could loan to an enterprise part of the government. And this small team could go make things work better, right? And they managed to get 100 or so people to do that. Now, how many people work for the federal government? Many, many millions. Again, it's just a misprioritization.
Have you, in the 10 or so years you've been focused on this, have you seen any progress, anything that's promising? I'm trying to leave us with something.
The cynical answer is that if you look at the things that we talked about a decade ago, I now hear them back to me from the people who were the target. That's good, right? That means we have an understanding. That's like, do you agree that you like my suit? And you go, or whatever, and you say yes, okay. That's not the same thing as performing an action. And I have not seen these core issues addressed yet. And I think that collectively, all of us have a shared interest in getting an innovation culture into the way the requirements process, technically known as the POM, works. There are what are called OTAs and other kind of special authorities. SOCOM and SOF have special authorities. I've always been in favor of expanding those because that's how the military and the various players can legally work with you, right? And believe it or not, they want to work with you, you want to work with them, and the system does not essentially make the mating possible.
What about the private sector piece of this? It was, 5 or so years ago when Google employees revolted over a contract with DoD. That posture seems to have changed right now, but you could imagine it shifting back for any number of reasons. If there's a change in the president in January, if there's dissension over the war in Gaza, you could imagine employees starting to feel very differently. How do you think the private sector is approaching the national security dimensions of this? And do you worry about another rupture between the two?
So I was the chairman of Google, or Alphabet technically, during that period. But because I was working with the military, I was not allowed to participate in that decision. And I disagreed with it and did so publicly. I think it was a mistake. That's my opinion. Maven ultimately was picked up by a number of other companies, and today is a good example of the military starting in the open source world, where they were doing training with something called, the technical people will know this, it's called YOLO. You only look once. It's a particular identification library. And then that has been moved into the secret domain, and I obviously don't know what they're doing on the secret side, but you have to assume that they're using it as intended. So I think the Maven example was to the industry a notification that they had to get their act together on the use of their technology in these things. And Google and every other company put in an ethics board. And Google, after Maven, had a board that was essentially run in the legal department, where there were trade-offs. They took a position of a certain level of defense was good and a certain amount of offense was not good. That is a legitimate decision from a private company. There were also plenty of companies who are based here and are in the room who are perfectly willing to help the government on the offensive side. That is a legitimate private sector decision. And I keep hearing about more and more of these companies. So I know it's happening. I know that the other big companies are doing it with their federal divisions. What seems to be the problem now is the valley of death remains. So you start your company, you have a great product, I'll give you an example, hypersonics, quantum, GPS-free navigation, various drones and automation kind of companies. There's a whole bunch. It's very, very hard for them to get through that. The government announced through DIU, which is a great group, and they were here yesterday, that they were doing something called Replicator, which is essentially a new way of doing procurement. So that's a good one. Maybe there are others as well.
Let me get a couple more questions in, and then I will go to the audience for questions from all of you. Let's talk about Ukraine. You've been incredibly gone to Ukraine many times. I'm not sure how many. You've been a very close observer and analyst of the war, especially the drone and technology dimensions. As you watch what's been playing out in Ukraine over the past couple of years, which has changed in totally remarkable and fascinating ways, we've watched the battlefield. What does that tell you about the future of conflict? If you think about war more broadly, what lessons are you taking from the battlefield in Ukraine, especially when it comes to...
Well, actually, you and I traveled together the first time, and we actually compared notes, and I learned a lot from you on that. I started looking at Ukraine as it's a real war, and I wanted to understand it myself. And it's so brutal, I cannot describe to you the brutality. It would make me actually start crying. To see the people in the ICU trains, these are young men typically, and to see what war does to human beings, it is to be avoided at all costs. What happened in Ukraine was, first you had the shock of the actual invasion, then you had this innovative period. And during that innovative period, people did whatever it took to push back on the attackers, and they built, among other things, the first set of drones that are very, very militarily droned and using them in the battlefield. That innovation cycle continues. There are many, many problems in Ukraine, starting with not enough people, draft age needs to be lowered, all sorts of, there's corruption and confusion. You know, it's a post-Soviet state, and it carries with that. But the people are wonderful, right? And they deserve a chance. Right now, a couple of rules to know. First, Russia is organizing, from what I can read, and again, I'm not briefed on this, so I can talk about this in any way. Above Kharkiv, which is in the upper right-hand corner, there's massing expected. Near Avdiivka, on the lower right corner, lower east, you have massing on the Russians. It's going to be very important that the supplemental, which was approved, but approved way too late, that those armaments get to the Ukrainians to hold the Russians off. I think most people think that that'll hold. So then the question is, what happens after that? And my answer is, I don't know. Today on the battlefield, and I've been to the FLOT a number of times, the actual area of conflict is so dangerous that there are drones in the day from both sides that if you walk out in roughly 3 minutes, if you see the drone, you're dead. So it's that dangerous. So people don't obviously walk out. It's true for trucks and so forth. At night, the same thing is true because of thermal cameras who can detect you. So there's a very narrow window where you can move at dusk dawn each 12 hours. That's bizarre. Yeah. The real question is, if you just assume that that line does not move, how does the war end? And that's an area that I'm not an expert in. But I hate to tell you, but I think the war will go on for a pretty long time.
Let me get 2 more questions in before we go to all of you. First, I want to talk about AI talent in the United States. We talk about various constraints on innovation, but one of them is just the talent and minds and researchers who are doing the most important work. One of America's strengths in this should be our open society and our history of immigration. That's, of course, an incredibly fraught political issue here. Do you worry about that undermining our lead?
We have the privilege of being in Washington, and Washington makes some mistakes, but literally the stupidest mistake that Washington has ever made is to take the smartest people in the world, bring them to our country, educate them to death, not literally, and then kick them out. And then they go to another country and they create a competitor to Americans. You will never convince me that that is a good strategy. And because it's so obviously correct that you should take the top STEM talent in the world, bring them to our country, basically educate them as much as you can, give them a green card, assuming they're legal and they're well-behaved, which they typically are, and they want to stay, so forth. If you look at the quantum program in China, the quantum program was started by somebody who was forced out of America. Now, quantum is a really big deal, and China is really good at it. That was a really stupid decision. So thank God we have free speech here. I'm going to call this the stupidest policy ever. We should take the smartest people, which I define as the math and science people who want to work on competitiveness. We want to get them in the country and keep them here.
From your mouth to Congress's ears, I suppose we can say. Last question. I'm sure there's a ton of speculation in this room about how quickly we will get to AGI. So I'm curious, one, what your timeline is, but perhaps more importantly, what does the US government and the national security community have to do to be prepared for that moment?
Well, so let me give you a set of arguments to think about it. First, we have large language models now. You're beginning to see agents and long context windows and what is called text to action happen. Those basically mean that the system can begin to not just understand verbally what you meant and translate it, which is impressive, but it can begin to take actions, right? So when that happens, you have the ability for a human to say in words what they want the computer to do, and then the computer can write Python code or something that will make it happen. This starts simple. Turn off the lights, right? Change my voice to speak a different language, all those kinds of things. But it looks to me like you can ultimately do what is called chain of thought reasoning, where you can basically generate recipes that you can begin to show the steps. And because computers are very powerful, you can do that. I think most people will say that when you can say what you want and the computer does it, that's pretty much general intelligence. The question of when will human thought be mimicable, in other words, when will a computer have its own idea, is much harder to know, and I'm much more skeptical about that. Because it's not obvious to me how we would do that, but it might occur. The US government, I've been working along with the usual suspects, and the US government has taken the right approach. Basically, there's a threshold of 10 to the 26 flops, which is a relatively arbitrary number, but it basically means that above that number, you have to let the government know that you're doing these things. That's a good rule. But it doesn't say the government can tell you what to do, but you have to let them know. My own view Not now, and not in the next generation, and maybe not in the next generation, but if the power laws continue to scale, which they look like they are, at some point in the next 5 years, these systems will be dangerous enough in terms of their ability for a human to get them to do bad things. Think biology, think cyber, that the government will probably have to start regulating them. You don't want to regulate beforehand, and you don't want to regulate after. That's why it's really important for the government and the companies to talk to each other. Let me give you some examples of where this is not going to work. Europe has an EU Act which makes it almost impossible to innovate at our scale, which guarantees that Europe, fine people, are not going to play in this game. Well, AI is the game, because the development of non-human intelligence that makes our world better is the game for the rest of our lives, along with the China question. So I think and I already said China, I suspect, will have trouble with getting through this. So I think we're going to be pretty good. So far, the government has done well. The UK government started, the US government followed. There's a series of meetings that I'm in Korea and then in France in the next 12 months that are all in the same philosophy, which seems to be right.
I'm going to go to questions from the audience. I'll try to get a few in. There should be mics coming around. Please stand and make it a crisp single question. Front row to start.
Front row, yeah, yes, ma'am. How are you?
I am great, and I'm excited to be at this expo. I'm carrying a card for Africa.
Yes.
In all that you said, not once did Africa feature. And I'm here to say that with a population that by 2050 would be almost 3 billion people, a continent that currently boasts just about $3 trillion in GDP, with an average age of 18.2 years across the continent, the youngest of continents, with a world that's an aging population, whether in America, Europe, and even Asia. Surely, this era of structural change in the global economy that will be occasioned by massive AI cannot happen without Africa. As one who is a protagonist for this, where do you see Africa in the equation? And what must Africa do in order to own this century?
So thank you for that. When I was CEO of Google, I had a rule that I would always put 10 people into a country in Africa, no matter what happened, because it was so important. We ultimately worked very hard to wire Africa, and the submarine cables that go around Africa on the east or the west are largely due to Google's efforts. That is the start of the solution. The core problem in Africa is you don't have enough technical universities. So the most important thing from my perspective is to get more technical universities in every country that can. I'll give you an example. 15 years ago, I went to Kenya, which is a wonderful country, and I visited my friend who's a computer science professor, and he says, I love Google. And I said, well, I love Google too. I'm the CEO. And he says, no, I love Google. And I said, why? And he said, we don't have textbooks. He was using Google to teach computer science to graduate students, right? We need 1,000 of those people all throughout the country. Otherwise, what will happen is that Africa will use AI to help with natural resources, human activity, but you won't invent it. You need that technical capability.
Christian, let's go to the front row over here.
Schmidt, thank you for your leadership on this topic. Just interested to get your perspective on what the key asymmetrical threats are going to be as this technology proliferates and develops.
Asymmetrical threats in what area?
So if you think about asymmetrical threats that we've seen in this country, 9/11, how that emerged, but also whether it's an emerging country that gets hold of a capability and then deploys it in a way that gives it an advantage against countries such as big and resource as the United States.
I think we want to distinguish between terrorist asymmetrical threats and small country, big country. So the terrorist is going to be a problem because the spread of the LLMs and so forth contain knowledge that can allow them or make it easier for them to engage in terrorist activities, easier to build bombs, easier to do biological things. The information is already published, but they can show you the recipe. We need a solution for that. For smaller countries and larger countries, I think a lot of it will be a function of how well the countries organize their technology people, right? So small countries using powerful technology groups, starting with the universities, can really overmatch the larger countries that are not innovative. And we're seeing that now in Ukraine versus Russia.
The next question is over here.
Thanks for the discussion. Going back to U.S.-China competitiveness, my question is specific about the AI supply chain. There's a big effort in the U.S. government to regulate out a lot of Chinese components from the supply chain. The question is, how do we thread the needle of doing that, but at the same time not damaging U.S. industries? And one example is like the autonomous vehicle space. There's a lot of components like LiDAR. Most of these companies use LiDAR from China. How do we, potentially restrict something like that, but not do it before there is a substitute available in the United States? Is the answer something like the CHIPS Act or something else?
So the way to understand what you said is that the government spent a fair amount of time discussing decoupling. And during the time in the Trump administration, a bunch of people said they were going to decouple. Our trade with China went up, and Chinese trade was up. So I think it's much better to think of China and the U.S. as Siamese twins, one body, two heads, where they really don't like each other and they're tired of each other, but they really are dependent on each other. And I actually think that codependence is positive for global safety, right? That is my opinion. So the technical question that you asked about CHIPS Act is great. I helped push for it. I think it's really helped. It's a good example where America 20 years ago got out of an industry that we shouldn't have, and that money will help keep us there. It'll help in the Samsung fab. It'll help in the TSMC fab in Arizona. It'll help with Intel in Indiana, wherever they're doing it, a whole bunch of stuff like that. So it helps. Think about global foundries in New York. It helps them build another plant. That's good for America. So on the problem we have is we are critically dependent for the non-strategic stuff. And it sure looks like China is going to get to very large share, maybe 90 or 95% share of key components in slower speed semiconductors, technically above 22 nanometers, the bigger ones, which are the primary ones that are used, for example, in automobiles and things like that. They're also clearly going to be the world suppliers in batteries, control systems, and so forth. Those are important industries. It seems like we're letting that go, and that's a mistake in my view.
Let's do one more on that side. We've heard a lot at this conference about China, the alarm bells. Very little about Russia. Why is that?
Well, again, we're in Washington, so I'll ask the question rhetorically. Washington's focus is on great power competition with China. That's a good thing to focus on. We're not at war with China, right? We're not shooting at each other. We're not arming Chinese competitors to shoot at them, whereas we're doing the same thing in Ukraine and Russia. Also, look at the terrible conflict in Israeli-Arab conflicts. So there's sort of a misprioritization that everybody wants to have the strategic conversation, which is very interesting. But there's a real fight over here. We need to make sure that the things we're giving to Ukraine work, right? So, for example, Russia has the strongest EW systems in the world, and many of the American weapons, when they went in, couldn't operate because they were based on GPS, which is a known vulnerability, and yet the requirements process didn't fix that. So there's a misprioritization, in my view, of focus. We should be able to walk and chew gum, at the same time. We should be able to focus on national competitiveness with respect to China, which is really important. And we should also be the strongest and have the strongest possible national security systems, alerts, monitoring, weapons, defenses, and so forth. And I think that's part of what this conference is really about.
Eric, my only complaint about the SCSP team is they didn't give us another 40 minutes. So we'll have to stop. But thank you so much for this event.
I want to thank everybody. Thank you, Dan. You've been a great friend and partner on this. And thank you all. I really want to see you here next year. Please come.